As you can maybe tell, this is a re-record of the sermon I preached yesterday in church, Good Shepherd Sunday. We had a little bit of Zoom trouble, and so this seemed the easiest way to get a recording that would be not annoying to watch. So, the text has been read. It was from the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Did you know that sheep and flocks are mentioned literally hundreds of times in the Bible, using 12 different Hebrew words and 4 different Greek words? They seem somehow to be an important part of God's story, biblically speaking. And rarely, though, are sheep kind of the subjects of the story. They're the objects. They're part of the context. They're often understood as part of the metaphor. But I think most people, when thinking about the Bible, wouldn't say it's a book mostly about sheep. So if it's not about sheep, what is with all the sheep in these stories? Well, the easy answer is that sheep were important to the nomadic and agricultural life of the Hebrews and similar peoples to whom and about whom all the stories in the Bible were addressed. If you were telling stories about life in that day and age, there were simply sheep around. If the Bible were to be written today, what do you suppose would show up as part of the background context? I suspect we would hear a lot about screens, because screens are everywhere, aren't they? At the drive-thru, at the bank, in our living rooms, in our pockets. And in this part of the country, in Manitoba, we would tell stories that involve vehicles and roads. Most of us spend time in cars, getting to and from wherever we want to go. Might be something about planting fields, gardens. We have a lot of those. We would include stories about shopping and grocery stores, bills, particularly related to electricity and gas, no doubt. There'd be credit cards, there'd be debit cards. I think we would use figures of speech about weather in a world where we control a lot of things. We don't control the weather, and so we talk about that a lot. Instead, what we get in the Bible stories are images of sheep and shepherds. And in today's story, also a gate. My favorite part of today's story might be the part where the writer of John's Gospel says Jesus used these figures of speech with them, but they didn't understand what he was saying to them. Because I find it is hard to sort out, even now, what is he trying to say? Is Jesus the shepherd? Is Jesus the gate? Is he both? Because that's kind of what it says. The Gospel of John rarely uses parables, and in this case, there are too many mixed images in the chapter to try and make it be a straightforward allegory or parable. It's more like a bunch of symbols sort of mashed up together, and we're supposed to figure out how they go together. And plus, it begins with very truly, which we know is John's Gospel's tricky way of saying, therefore. In other words, this is related to what I was just talking about in chapter 9. Only if you go back to chapter 9, it doesn't really help that much. Well, it's supposed to, I suppose, but what precedes these words of shepherds and sheep and gates is a story about someone who is blind, but who can see better than anyone of the powerful leaders who have their 20/20 vision. Jesus takes the opportunity to challenge and chastise the community leaders, both political and temple leaders, who are seeing all the wrong things and directing people in all the wrong ways. And that therefore, John says, so this is something about leadership and the voices we pay attention to and how we see the world. Did you hear him specifically note that sheep know the shepherd's voice? They listen for the shepherd's voice. But this passage really is mostly centered around a gate. And at first, we might not know what to do with a gate. I certainly don't. It sounds like a private club or a gated community where, the special people live and keep the undesirables out. But then I remember that, this passage is talking about gates for sheep, not mansion dwellers. And my yard has a gate. Maybe yours does too. And if you think about the gates you use, they're not actually the barrier or the fence. That's the thing about gates. They're the things that create openings in these places. They don't keep things contained. They are a doorway or an opening towards which life can flourish. And you can go back and forth through them. Sheep can move freely and safely and find the nourishment they need in this Bible version. It occurs to me that gates are ways to cross divides. Now that's interesting, isn't it? The gates are always places of movement. You don't need a gate unless you're passing through. I looked on my phone trying to find pictures of gates to use for social media, and the only things that would come up were pictures of gates at the airport. Those gates you have to go to gate whatever to get on your plane? Now, isn't that interesting? That is certainly a gate made for passing through. Evangelical Lutheran Michael Cray argues that all of us, in one way or another, are constantly passing through gates. But he thinks about them more than just like physical gates. He talks about the thresholds that we trust to bring us somewhere or into something. So he talks about more than physical things. He talks about moving through ambitions or relationships or identities or expectations. Often believing if we can just get through that next thing, achieve the next goal, secure the stability, prove this worth, then we'll finally arrive at this place of rest or fulfillment. And these become, in a sense, the gates we put our trust in. Or they might be like transition times, right? The gate of retirement. Or the kinds of gates that are like belief systems, worldviews, like the gate of Christianity. Now, I think it's helpful to remember that experience teaches us not every gate leads to what it promises, right? Some take us into spaces that are narrower than we expected, that might feel safe at first, but then we realize they just confine us. Sometimes we choose a direction that offers the promise of safety and worth, only to leave us feeling overwhelmed or diminished or even isolated. I wonder what gates you are facing right now. And who and what are the leaders holding up directions, asking you to trust them for your future as you pass through? Follow this path, make this decision, cross this threshold. I wonder also if there are leaders or guides who are holding up a vision of abundant life, which is in reality something that relies on stealing or destruction. Because that's what Jesus talks about too. People who don't use this gate are kind of like thieves. And it's not always easy to find connections between our biblical symbolism and contemporary life. It's hundreds of years, thousands of years apart. Occasionally, however, the comparisons seem so obvious they don't even seem worth mentioning. I feel a little silly, honestly, but I can't help but notice the obvious ways that faith and Christianity, there's your gate, are finding their way into our public discourse, into the headlines. We have, for example, right now, a conflict between the President of the United States and the Pope, arguably the most famous spiritual leader, certainly the most famous Christian spiritual leader on the planet. both offering different perspectives on the gates they want us to pass through, or invite us to pass through. And at the very time we're reading these Bible stories where Jesus warns about those who will pretend to be the real thing, we have this political leader from the United States who posts a photo of himself online where he is literally pretending to be Jesus. And then taking it back, I suppose. But could there be a more obvious example? I don't know. Now, the thieves that Jesus talks about don't have to be those kind of obvious things, or the leaders that the Pope referred to as the tyrants controlling the world, although the comparison might be there. But sometimes the kinds of stealing and destroying we experience as we travel through our gates are much quieter realities, the kind of things that erode us over time. You know, like those inner voices that make us wonder about our worth, the systems that limit who gets what, even the fears that separate us from those who, at first glance, seem to be different. Those can be the kind of thieves that come into our thresholds, eh? So then, how do we find the voices that we wish to follow? That's our question. Where are the gates that truly lead to life? And we have this challenge because we have to differentiate ourselves from all the stuff we get in the Disney movies about what abundant life looks like. Is that the same as happily ever after? I don't know. Our Disney movies don't do a very good job of preparing us for real life, do they? They lead us to listen for voices that promise fairy tale endings in life that doesn't really have that villains. It isn't really true that villains get toppled automatically because they are villains. Fairness doesn't always win the day in this world. We have to work really hard to make that happen. We don't live in fairy tales. And so as we pass through this real life, we have to look for the gates that lead to abundant life in the midst of that kind of thing, not an animated special, right? So how do we find them? Well, this is tricky. I'll tell you though, recently I saw an interview between the two co-leads, the leadership of a group called Interact International. Aziz Abbasara and Mayoz Inan, I'm sorry if I don't have their names right, a Palestinian and an Israeli, both of whom have had terrible tragedies personally because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And yet they have come together because they are committed to the idea that peace, while difficult, while challenging, is possible. And I saw an amazing interview with the two of them. It's probably online somewhere, you might find it, talking about the gates that they pass through with each other. And they're talking about a town hall meeting, for example, where Aziz was telling a story about his own father, who stood up in this mixed group and said, okay, about this, thing you talk about where, this Holocaust, like, did that really happen? And Aziz was incredibly embarrassed. Oh, Dad, sit down. Shut up, Dad. But there you had a real moment of truth. And then a Palestinian speaker said, okay, here's the thing. I'm not going to ask you to believe in something you've never been taught about. But I'm going to invite you to come with me, and I can tell you my story. Come with me to this Holocaust museum. We'll travel through it, and I will tell you the story of me and my people. And so I think 45 people gathered to do that, to hear a story. And was it easy? No. In fact, there were moments that were quite tense, apparently. And yet, they listened to each other's stories, maybe for the first time. And then they asked each other to kind of do the reverse. Could these Israeli people go with the Palestinians, travel through something in Gaza, and hear their story? This, it seems to me, is an interesting way to pass through gates of knowledge and experience on a way to peace. It sounds like leadership to me. But in the end, I really don't know the answer about how we find the right gates. I mean, maybe we trial and error. We go back and forth between and go in and out. I'm a bit like the disciples who struggled to find exactly where the meaning is in the symbolism, or if there is some sort of magic gate, but I think it's probably not. There's something, though, about the doorways that Jesus will open that aren't quite the same as the others that are clamoring for our attention. Jesus isn't offering a happy ending, but certainly the beginning of a new way. And I'm thinking about this in the context of the Easter season. So we're already reminding ourselves that the message of Easter is not the same as the voices around telling us that we're worthless, for example, or telling us that revenge will make us feel better and make the world better, or telling us that violence and hate could bring peace, telling us that broken things aren't worth restoring, or evil and death are the most powerful forces in the universe. No, Easter and Jesus offer voices behind a lot of gates that are different, that have abundant life for everyone. Not a destination with a permanent fence, but a space where we might move freely to discover things like worth and restoration and forgiveness and love. Abundant life isn't about getting a lot of stuff. In John's gospel, it's a depth of life that is rooted in relationship, in freedom from fear, in participation in something that is bigger than we are. I can't help but think that if we listen, truly listen, we will hear that voice calling. And then we just have to open the gate. May God help us find our way. Amen.